In 1957, in a house in Switzerland, a man sat across from Audrey Hepburn and asked her to play his dead daughter in a movie. She said no. The man was Otto Frank. He was the only member of his family to come back from the camps. His daughter was Anne, and the diary she had kept while hiding from the Nazis had, by then, been translated into a dozen languages and turned into a Broadway play. 20th Century Fox was making the film. Otto Frank wanted Audrey Hepburn to play her. On paper, there was no better casting decision available anywhere on Earth. The two girls had been born just over 5 weeks apart in 1929. They had spent the war about 60 miles from one another in occupied Holland. Anne sealed inside a hidden annex behind an office building in Amsterdam. Audrey in the town of Velp, just outside Arnhem, on the wrong side of the front line. Same country, same occupation, same hunger. Audrey Hepburn turned it down. And then she turned down every version of it that came afterward for the rest of her life. The reason she gave publicly was that she was too old for the part. That was true. It was not the reason. What she said privately is one of the most devastating things any actor has ever said about a role. And once you know it, the last years of her life, and the very last thing she ever did on a stage, stop looking like charity work and start looking like something she had been carrying since she was 15. Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt on the 12th of June, 1929. Audrey Kathleen Rustin was born in Brussels on the 4th of May of the same year. Both families ended up in the Netherlands for the same reason. The Franks fled Germany because Holland was supposed to be safe. Audrey's mother moved her there in 1939 on exactly the same logic. On the 10th of May, 1940, German forces crossed the border, and both of those calculations turned out to be wrong. In July of 1942, the Franks disappeared into the annex behind Otto's office on the Prinsengracht, where Anne would spend 25 months without once going outside. Audrey stayed in the open, in Velp. One difference: Anne Frank was Jewish. Audrey Hepburn was not. That single fact is the entire distance between a girl who died of typhus at Bergen-Belsen at 15 and a girl who became the most photographed woman in the world. Audrey knew that. She knew it precisely. And there is no evidence she ever stopped knowing it. Her uncle, Otto van Limburg-Stierum, was a magistrate who would not cooperate with the occupation. On the 15th of August, 1942, the Nazis executed him. One of 5 hostages shot in reprisal for a resistance action he had nothing to do with. Audrey was 13 years old. Hold on to that. 5 hostages. That date. She saw the rest of it from close range. She later described watching Jewish families loaded onto boxcars at the station and executions in the street. She was in Velp when the fighting came directly through in 1944. Then came the winter. German blockades cut the supply lines, and the Western Netherlands starved. People were surviving on a few hundred calories a day. Audrey's family ate tulip bulbs. She developed anemia, edema, respiratory illness. She was 15 and too weak to dance, the only thing up to that point she had ever wanted from her life. She also worked, quietly. She carried messages in underground newspapers, and she danced at closed fundraising performances in rooms where the audience was not permitted to applaud, because the sound could get every person there killed. When liberation came, relief workers arrived with food and medicine, and Audrey ate so much of it so fast that she made herself sick. She never forgot who had handed it to her. Remember that? It comes back. In 1947, Anne Frank's diary was published in Dutch. Audrey read it. She was 18 years old, and what she said about that reading, decades later, is the most important thing on the record about her. She said she had marked the passage where Anne wrote that 5 hostages had been shot that day, because that, Audrey said, was the day her uncle was shot. She was reading a stranger's diary and finding her own life inside it. A girl she had never met, locked in an annex 60 miles away, had written down a full report of everything Audrey had experienced and never been able to say out loud to anyone. She described it later in the plainest words she had. It was a little, she said, as if this had happened to her sister. In a way, Anne was her soul sister. And then she did not talk about it publicly for the better part of 40 years. Because meanwhile, something else was happening to Audrey Hepburn. 1951. The novelist Colette spotted her on a film set in Monte Carlo and cast her, with no stage experience whatsoever, as the lead in the Broadway production of Gigi. 1953, Roman Holiday. 1954, the Academy Award for Best Actress at 24, and a Tony 3 days later. Then Sabrina and Givenchy, and within 3 years, she had become the international shorthand for elegance itself. That is the image. The black dress, the gloves, the effortlessness. And every person looking at that image was looking at a woman who had eaten tulip bulbs at 15 to stay alive. She did not correct them. She let the image stand. For most of her career, she simply did not discuss the war. In May of 1957, Otto Frank signed a contract with 20th Century Fox for a film version of his daughter's diary. George Stevens would direct it. Stevens wanted Audrey Hepburn, and by multiple accounts, so did Otto Frank himself. That year, Audrey met Frank and his second wife, Elfriede, in Switzerland. It is worth being exact about who was in that room. Otto Frank had gone into hiding in 1942 with his wife, his 2 daughters, and 4 other people. 8 went in. He was the only one who came out. His wife Edith died at Auschwitz. His daughters Margot and Anne both died at Bergen-Belsen. Within weeks of the camp being liberated, he came back to Amsterdam alone. And one of the women who had helped hide them, a secretary named Miep Gaze, gave him a stack of papers she had been keeping in her desk drawer. It was Anne's diary. The day after the arrest, Miep and a colleague named Bep Vos-Kyle had gone up into the annex to see what could be saved and found Anne's writing scattered across the floorboards, where the police had dumped it while searching the room for valuables. A red and white checked notebook, more notebooks after the first one filled up, and several hundred loose sheets. A rewrite Anne had begun that spring, after hearing a radio broadcast from the Dutch government in exile, asking people to hold on to their diaries and letters. She had decided she was going to publish a book about the annex once the war was over. Miep never read a word of it. She was keeping it to give back to Anne. She only handed it to Otto once it had been confirmed that Anne was dead. That was the man sitting across from her. And he was asking the one actress alive who had survived the same occupation to play the daughter who hadn't. She said no. The public reasons were real. She was 28, would be 30 by the time cameras rolled, and did not believe she could convincingly play a girl of 15. She had also already committed to another picture. But the reason she gave later is the sentence this entire story turns on. She said that she was so destroyed by it, again, that she couldn't deal with it. Not that it would be difficult, not that it would be draining, that she could not do it. So Stevens went looking for an unknown and cast an 18-year-old model from New Jersey named Millie Perkins, who had never acted in her life. The film came out in 1959 and won 3 Academy Awards. Audrey Hepburn made Green Mansions instead, a picture directed by her husband that almost nobody has seen, and that is considered one of the weakest things she ever did. She never complained about the trade, never framed the refusal as a sacrifice, and never once used it in an interview to make herself look deeper than she was, which she could have done easily at any time. She declined, she moved on, and she kept not talking about it. Then the silence resumed, and it lasted decades. She married, she lost pregnancies, she had 2 sons. In 1967, she walked away from Hollywood entirely and moved to a farmhouse in Switzerland. Through all of it, the war stayed a closed subject. From the outside, that looks like avoidance. It was closer to a debt that hadn't been paid yet. In 1988, at 58, Audrey Hepburn accepted an appointment as a Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF. Over the next 5 years, she went to Ethiopia during famine, to Sudan during a civil war, to Bangladesh, Vietnam, El Salvador, and Somalia, conditions that would have been punishing for someone 30 years younger. She said it plainly. She was not interested in promoting Audrey Hepburn anymore. What she wanted was to make people who had never seen a famine look directly at one, which meant the unglamorous version of the job. Press conferences the morning she landed. Interview after interview, sometimes more than a dozen in a day, until she had no voice left. Speeches to donor governments and to the United Nations in several languages, naming the number of children who would die without the money. And when people asked her where it came from, she told them. She had been a child at the end of a war, receiving food and medicine from relief workers, and the organization that fed her became UNICEF. She was, in the most literal sense the word allows, paying it back. What she said to the children she sat with in those camps was, "I know what this feels like." In 1992, she flew into Somalia, into an active war, already ill and refusing to cancel. She came home from that trip with the cancer that would kill her. And then, in 1989, she did something nobody had asked her to do. She contacted the composer and conductor, Michael Tilson Thomas, and she asked him to build a piece of music around the words of Anne Frank's diary, so that she could read them aloud, not act them, read them. They chose the passages together. Tilson Thomas built the score around themes drawn from the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. UNICEF commissioned the work. It premiered on the 19th of March, 1990, at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. Audrey Hepburn stood on a stage at 60 and read the diary out loud while the orchestra played beside her. Then she did it again. Chicago, Houston, the General Assembly of the United Nations, and in London with the London Symphony Orchestra in May of 1991. Every performance was a benefit, so why no in 1957 and yes in 1990? Because they were not the same request. In 57, Otto Frank asked her to perform his daughter, to stand in front of a camera and pretend to be a girl whose diary had described Audrey's own life back to her in a stranger's handwriting, to act out a hunger she had actually felt, and then break for lunch. She couldn't. Not because it was too sad, because it would have been a performance, and the one thing she could not do with that material was pretend. So, she waited 33 years and found the only version of it she could stand. No costume, no character, no acting at all. Just Anne's actual sentences, in Audrey's actual voice, in a room full of people, raising money for children, living through the same thing somewhere else on Earth. That is not an actress finally accepting a part she turned down. That is a survivor finding the only honest thing to do with the words of a girl who did not survive. Audrey Hepburn died on the 20th of January, 1993, less than 2 years after that last performance in London. She was 63 years old. Anne Frank was 15, 60 miles away, 5 weeks younger. So, here's what I want to know from you. Was she right to say no in 57? Or is there a version of that film with Audrey Hepburn in it that we genuinely lost? Tell me in the comments. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to the channel. There's another one waiting on your screen right now.